Yeah, with carbon removal. Yeah.
It was awesome. It was very cold. Yeah.
The whole thing project that we enjoy once
yeah.
But in the living room, I was teaching the children how to chant.
Oh, that's good.
My daughter marched to the daycare.
That's really funny. Hey, how are you? It's so good to see you. Yeah, it's very. It's
never
really helpful.
Yeah, that's really.
Like, oh, the history. Oh my God!
That's happened in my September. The whole month of September. I don't know what happened with it.
Yeah.
This year is going to be known in my book as the year of 11 months.
Yeah.
This year it will be known as the year of 11 months. I don't know what happened with September.
I mean,
the mind-blowing thing was I kept thinking.
Welcome back. Doing it again.
California Center for like.
it feels all sorts of
So when it finished, I thought, oh, I'm going to replan it all.
you know, is there an age in the climate?
Like, at least know what I want because of that. Anyways.
Until the midterm, we're all going to live in some kind of...
Yeah, I think that's part of
A came out of nowhere. B makes no sense. Everyone's on.
I know, but that happens.
Well, as you said, you see,
fair point. Yeah.
Hilton's piece in
Yeah, so
about the three big assumptions.
what have you done?
Automatic innovation.
I think you have more interesting lives.
Worst case is something.
I'm interested in books. You don't have to.
Working directly with
How divided is your teams?
Yeah.
So, how long was the
that's what we said.
For international transaction and water.
Solar, I think, is absolutely
Global directors. The global directors.
I think
Are directors of all the activities on site.
It's pretty cool, actually. It's pretty. No, when I
doing.
when relative, I feel like the quality is at least I can enjoy this great.
It all means everyone is artist.
No. It's
not unlicensed.
It's efficient. It's like once you've been in the garden, I appreciate that.
I have many commentary about that. Why does this? Yeah.
So mainly
Yes, definitely. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I was there for 15 years up until last month. So, yeah, so it's kind of interesting because I always have to be like, do I know them from?
A number of times it was easy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she's great. She's still there. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the stuff she was doing on genes and genetic technology was, I always just sort of would hear about it. It's always a big deal, it's something exciting. Maybe I'm in this section. Oh, hi. It's nice to meet you. Yeah. Can I ask you your last name? Miracle. Okay, great. Like a miracle, right? Hi, yes, you're
That's how we're friends.
As you've seen, I've tried to.
Okay, well, Simon gave me, the rundown on how it's gonna work, and I looked at your PowerPoint. It's very nice.
I didn't do it.
Oh, okay.
I'm just gonna give it.
Great, you can take credit for it. Great.
That's because they did it. I would have to look at it.
I know, I was really impressed by the respectful way of the PowerPoint. That's really about 45 minutes. Well, no, Okay. Great, okay, so not use the doing like that in the. No, only one.
Up to you, yeah.
So would you like to stand up?
Would you like to be heated?
Yeah, so I can make it small.
Foundation would be fantastic.
Okay, great, and then nothing's good.
Yes.
I think the. Yeah, I don't know if the block can either way works. I know. It's always. Oh, hi, how are you doing? Hi, Brian. Great. Yes. And there's always nice to see it. Oh, you guys. Okay.
Your work for
Yeah.
And then.
seeing your face refine.
Yeah, it's really nice. Because I took sparks.
Counselor.
Right. Duffy.
Nocturnal for SDOs.
We just had it.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I so science studies and it's really yeah, I mean, not in like a way, but I did STS literature. Yeah, so that's what it was. Yeah.
I've been on
So you're
I chased after it. I was like,
I have a
I'm not saying
Sure enough. It is hard.
I just
right?
there is less.
all we have to do is fix
Yeah, he's based on my yeah, but it's training. What are you doing?
And probably needed more of it. Alright.
yeah, I mean that's been the primary when I've left.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this is it's actually
And the whole day.
I am now it's like, no, so I'm actually focused on, I'm in the global But I agree, and some more folks who overseas.
Yeah. It's always nice to see clients feel that I can make sense.
And then specifically the two around
Well, you know, but it is important, you know, one of the statements
Yeah, I heard.
government level, like yeah, cities and states, businesses. Yeah, exactly. And then you're also yeah, fair bit. Trying to be high.
Last Rachel.
A lot of our meetings. Yeah, it's hard to.
Is that since I've seen it?
I remember it. So I mean,
But I have to go.
one is editing.
Yeah. No, I do want to go, and I'm trying to bring them to cut out some and we have. But it's just there's a real
I also guess some sense of the opposite.
you know.
There's like a
well, and I mentioned what's in your posture.
No, I said I'm gonna check with make sure I keep it through. Professor because on your bio it's
We're also individual faculty.
yeah.
I don't know why they changed.
Get here. Always have
There's a live stream.
Yeah, that was the thing about the last year. I was I took him on.
And it's also while you're doing any of the words that you said you never do it, never get it.
I'll send you that.
Yeah, no, Was the same. We're like, we did well. It was very nice.
I'm really interested. 2 weeks ago. So you're doing it? Yeah. But I mean, I'm having a lot of time. I'm doing it with coffee. You gotta stay close. We'll take over here. All right, now that'll always a pleasure starting. Yeah, okay. Let's do it. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Dan Sarowitz at Arizona State University, Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. Thank you for coming to this event today. We are, I'll just say, generally making a big effort to try to build up the community in DC who is interested in issues of science, technology, society, and policy. And maybe no stranger issue lurks out there than that of the idea of intervening in the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere in ways that would be beneficial to the future of the planet and our societies. And interestingly, very much in contrast to most technologies, this is one that we've started out thinking a lot about how to govern the technology and what its future might look like long before there's anything that actually looks like a real technology. And I guess from our perspective, that's probably a good thing because it means there's a lot more reflexivity in the system than there often is when we find out, say, that, oops, social media ruined democracy. Now what do we do? Geoengineering, climate intervention, whatever you want to call it, is a really interesting, complex, troubling space. And fortunately, some really smart, interesting, motivated people are trying to occupy that space. So I'll turn it over to one of them, Simon Nicholson, who has run this project, the report of which you're about to hear a discussion on. And I don't know if there's anything else to say, except if you haven't gotten lunch, please get it. The basic format will be about 45 minutes of panel discussion and then 45 minutes of you all engaging in conversation with the panel. So again, thanks for being here, and hope to see you at future events. And Simon, thanks so much for taking this on and your leadership on it. So, cheers. Thank you.
Again, Simon Nicholson with the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment at American University. Thanks to Dan, Sarowitz, Mahmoud, Kim, if you're here, for all of their help organizing this event through Arizona State University. I won't say much, except to say that the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment was the group that convened the academic working group that produced this new report. The report is titled Governing Solar Radiation Management. We have 3 of the 14 authors of the report with us today. To present the report's main findings and to characterize the effort. The person who's going to moderate the event for us is Megan Parker, who's Executive Director with the Society for Environmental Journalists. I'll turn over to Megan to introduce the panelists and the format. Megan, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, Dan, for hosting us here in this lovely space. It's really quite beautiful. And, I was preparing for this event. I was thinking this is really a remarkable moment to be here and to discuss the recommendations and policy options that report presents as this discussion moves out from sort of academic circles that it has been mainly into actual policy steps. So I'm really excited to be here today to help moderate this discussion and to hear from you as well when we get to Q&A. There are two reasons, actually, that I was thrilled when Simon contacted me. First, in my former role, for 15 years, up until last month, I worked at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Environmental Change and Security program there, where we also work to create actionable ideas and concrete policy options for some of the complicated problems like climate mitigating and adapting to climate change. And we looked at climate engineering and some of the options in a couple of our research reports, because we're particularly concerned about ensuring that as we try to do good, as we try to take steps to mitigate and adapt to climate change, that we weren't inadvertently causing harm or spurring conflict or bringing more harm to those that are already going to be the most vulnerable to climate change. So this report is incredibly important to that dialogue by saying, if we're going to do this, if we're going to use this tool in our toolbox, let's make sure we know how to do it right before we begin. And the second reason I'm really excited to be here today is in my new role with the Society of Environmental Journalists. You know, this is a hot topic. This is something that's pretty sexy, you know, it could be in the newspaper, but for journalists, it's also hard to understand. And so, again, the report does a really nice job of breaking down into more easily understood options and ideas that journalists can also share with the wider public and help remove some of the confusions and, dare I say it, fake news out there about these options and be able to share it with their readers. So the format for today, we're going to start with an introduction to the report with a PowerPoint from Andrew Light. And as many of you probably know, Andrew Light is the University Professor of Philosophy, Public Policy, and Atmospheric Sciences, as well as Director of the Institute of Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. And he's also a Distinguished Senior Fellow at WRI. Until March 2016, he was Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Climate Change in the State Department, where he served on the strategy team for the UN climate negotiations. After Andrew presents the report, we're going to hear from two other members of the working group that produced the report. Walter Valdivia is a Senior Policy Editor in the Mercatus Center, also at George Mason University. Prior to joining George Mason, he was a Senior Fellow for the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, who's also hosting us here today. And then Paul Wapner, who is a professor at American University, will talk as well about another aspect of the report. His research focuses on global environmental politics and ethics, among many other things. And he's currently writing a book titled Is Wildness Over?, which I certainly hope the answer is no to that one. And then Genevieve Miracle, who is the Global Knowledge and Innovation Lead in the Climate and Energy Policy at WWF, will offer some discussant remarks on the report. Before she joined WWF, she was Senior Policy Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, where she served as Samantha Power's Policy Advisor on Sustainable Development and Climate Change, and the Deputy Lead U.S. Negotiator for the Sustainable Development Goals. So now I'd like to invite Andrew to come up. And it's there.
Thanks very much, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to our hosts here at ASU. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity here to just to give you a light touch, 15-minute or so introduction to the report, top lines of it. You've all got copies of it there. Those of you watching online, you can download it while we're speaking if you don't already have a copy of it. And talk about two things really. One, just sort of the main content of the report, and secondly, the process. And then I'll ask my co-authors of the report to fill in any gaps that they think that I should have covered, as well as we can answer more questions on it as we go through the rest of the event. So as Simon said, the academic working group of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment was convened in order to do a bunch of things, including writing this report, but also just to bring together a number of people, most of whom I think it's fair to say had not previously done a lot of work on climate engineering in general or solar radiation management in particular, but all of whom, although they came from different disciplines in the social sciences and law and the humanities, shared some kind of expertise on international governance, either in their written work or in the different positions they've had either in or outside of government. We decided to focus on solar radiation management for a number of reasons, probably best left for the discussion rather than including, as we talked at the beginning, for example, about potentially trying to make this climate engineering writ large, including carbon dioxide removal as well as SRM, CDR being the other sort of main category of climate engineering. But really given the particular, I think partly because of the nuances in what the potential technology could be here, and how it might how the different buckets of technology differ from each other, both in terms of their risk profile and their potential uses in the future, their integration more or less into international governance structures, decided to really kind of focus this on solar radiation, this report on solar radiation management, though keeping in mind that some of the recommendations that we do call for could potentially be applicable to carbon dioxide removal as well. Now, what is solar radiation management? There's lots of definitions of this and lots of active debate on this in the literature. As a bare bones notion, it is just simply some kind of idea for cooling the planet by reflecting sunlight into space. So we sort of think about the main components of the phenomenon that we refer to as climate change. Certainly one of those components, obviously, is solar radiation, the degree to which changes that humans are making to the atmosphere trap more heat on the planet, cause temperature to rise. Those temperatures cause adverse effects. That whole phenomenon is climate change. Traditionally, when we take on climate change, of course, we focus on two main areas. First of all, mitigation, reducing the sources of the human contribution to that, which of course is the production of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide. And on the other hand, adaptation to the warming that the planet will invariably go through just because of human activity so far, regardless of the amount of mitigation that we will do. And, footnote, if you need to know more, please read as much as you can of the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on the possibility of stabilizing temperature increase at 1.5 Celsius that was just released a couple of weeks ago, which I think is one of the best things that's ever come out here on the stakes and what we're talking about here. Now, with respect to the one clear thing we want to say at the top, and we repeat this in some of the principles that we developed for looking at the recommendations that we make, is that I think the clear sense in the literature now is that this is not a substitute for mitigation. So in my mind, personally, I think about this as the battle days, mostly caused by economists, which is often, where the battle days come from. So 15, 20 years ago, economists would sort of pick up and kind of look at the speculative literature on climate change and the ideas that were being bandied about, early modeling scenarios on the potential for at least reducing the contribution to climate change by at least reducing one of the factors, namely the amount of sunlight, right, that's hitting the planet, and said, well, QED, right? This will be cheaper than all of the scenarios, any scenario that anyone wants to put out in terms of the costs, especially a number of years ago, for the transition from carbon-intensive fuels to non-fossil sources of energy, let alone the cost of adaptation for the amount of temperature change we're going to see. And so given that that's cheaper, and we have a couple of people we can point to who at least claim that it could do the job, then that's it. That's what we need to do our investment in. And I'm very happy to say that those days are quite over. I believe, and I think that it was mostly a consensus view among most of the authors of this report, that you really can't find a credible person doing research in this area from the sciences to the humanities who's willing to sort of say that all you'd need to do to address climate change would be to invest in solar radiation management. If they are out there, they're certainly on the fringes now, and really are more or less pariahs in the field. This is certainly the sense that I got from going to my first meeting of the climate engineering conference. I guess this is I'm in the fourth one, just convened in Berlin. Yeah, the fourth one. This was right. in Berlin last year. And I think that most people involved in this debate, one way or the other, recognize this can never be a substitute for mitigation for various reasons. And so it can only go forward as part of an integrated understanding of a portfolio of measures to respond to climate change. Now, there's lots of different technologies. Dan put this exactly right at the top. One of the interesting things about this conversation, indeed, I would sort of say one of the frustrating things to some of the scientists involved in it, is that there's a ton of conversation about governance already before there's actually anything to govern. There is no thing that anyone, as far as we know, is going to shoot off into the stratosphere or deploy in order to actively do this, to try to deploy one of these now. There is, however, lots of computer modeling that's been done. There's been lots of different kinds of studies that have been done. And there have been a few field tests, not field experiments, that might actually generate some kind of temperature response, but tests of particular kinds of technologies, or at least parts of technologies, and these are going to be increasing. We expect that Harvard, for example, will be launching, from their geoengineering project, will be launching some kind of test probably within the next year. The two main categories, though, that people talk about in the literature, though in terms of a deployable technology, we don't know exactly what would eventually be produced, essentially two buckets. Stratospheric aerosol dispersion of some kind, so putting some kind of particles right into the stratosphere or the upper atmosphere that could have reflective property, reflecting sunlight or solar radiation back into space before it hits the planet and contributes to climate change, or marine cloud brightening, some kind of technology to increase the albedo effect, right, of marine clouds so that they're whiter and they reflect more sunlight into space. There are many other things that people have proposed that fall under these two general categories. The Harvard experiment, by the way, actually will be on the left side of the stratospheric aerosol, where you'll put a balloon up into the atmosphere. Right now, the proposal is to release about 1.5 pounds more of some kind of substance, likely calcium carbonate, which is, I like to, people ask me, well, is that dangerous? It's the active ingredient in Tums. So if you think 1.5 pounds of Tums, ground up Tums in the atmosphere is going to sort of harm you, then you should have a worry. If you don't think that that's a problem, then you probably shouldn't have a worry about the environmental effects of it. But that's where we're going. And of course, obviously, as we get towards something that could potentially be deployable, if we do go down that path, then these kinds of tests will get bigger. And they'll need to in order to eventually see if you can get some kind of temperature response on them. There is no one-size-fits-all profile on these technologies. You read the literature, it can divide still between those who say it's unambiguously a good thing or potentially a good thing, those who say it's a disaster, it will necessarily cause all kinds of harm. But essentially, we're looking at some kind of complicated risk-risk trade-offs between doing research and not doing research, deploying SRM eventually, or not deploying it eventually. And then lots in between in terms of what we're talking about in terms of the magnitude of deployment if you ever got to some level of deployment. So there's lots of risks that are talked about in the literature. We'll talk about some of them here. We'll talk about a lot of them in the report into some detail. It wasn't the purpose of the report was not to give a thorough evaluation of all of those risks. It wasn't our job, but to just take the emergence of the technology and the potential for it, not just in terms of what SRM could do, but what happens if we face the kinds of runaway climate change that we could potentially see in the absence of more ambitious mitigation efforts. And again, see the 1.5 report in terms of that. In fact, what I think is quite interesting about the 1.5 report is what a great job it did, and this is probably why it captured the imagination of the front page, of editors. I was more impressed with not with the number of environmental reporters who wrote on this report. That's their job. The number of editors, right? Megan, you may agree with me, I don't know, who put this in the pole position on the front page of the Times and the Post. Something that the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, huge meeting, didn't manage to land that kind of placement. But this report did, in part, I think, because it helped to crystallize not just all of the potential impacts of climate change, but just the difference between a world of increasing to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels and 2, right? A world, for example, just to take one of the talking points, or one of the points from that report, in a world of 2 degrees is a world where we most likely have no coral reefs. A world of 1.5, we still have some. And again, many different sort of takes on that. So governance has to be seen as occupying a space in between not only the benefits or burdens of doing the research and potentially deployment, but also of not doing it in the face of the problem that it's designed to take on. Why propose governance now? Research is moving forward, as we already indicated, and there's uncertainty about whether and how to govern SRM in the near term. For example, should this experiment that's going forward by Harvard, let's say in the next year, which I personally believe is environmentally benign, do we need some level of governance in the face of tests like that moving forward? Or is the current regime of governance for given environmental regulations, health and safety regulations, sufficient to do that? And that's the kind of questions that we were interested in. We would, all of us agreed though, that certainly the world is not ready for some level of deployment at this stage. And that is certainly why you'd need conversations on governance happening well ahead. This is nice pictures of all the members of the working group, again, said from a range of disciplines, from the social sciences to law to the humanities, primarily policy studies, and all worked together over the course of a little over 2 years. We had 5 meetings, 2 in Washington, 2 in Tarrytown, New York, and 1 in Berkeley. And at these meetings, I should say that the purpose of them was not to just get down to the hard work of hammering out the recommendations. The report weren't ready to do that any stretch of the imagination. I would say even within the first year, but really had to have in-depth conversations not only about the state of the science, but also the way in which we've seen different kinds of conversations about governance in different forms. What lessons have we learned from nanotechnology, from synthetic biology, from other new and emerging technologies, and what has worked and what has not worked? And all of that went together in terms of the recommendations that we put together. As to the report itself, as I hope I've conveyed now, there's much disagreement. Let's say this, but go back to our pictures here. A lot of disagreement here. Lots of disagreement. Let me just say it again. Lots of disagreement among these folks on how do they look at the technology. Some folks, some of the people on I would think it's fair to say, members of the academic working group, very concerned about the technology, very worried about not just potential deployment, but also whether or not research leads to a slippery slope, whether it creates some kind of moral hazard from the get-go. Whereas others on another end of the spectrum, ready to move forward with research right now, feel that because of the existential threat posed by climate change, we can't leave any potential technology unturned, and just want to see if there's something that potentially could be deployed. So lots of differences there. So as opposed to some other previous reports that have been done on SRM, such as the Bipartisan Policy Center's report from a number of years ago, which advocated for a concentrated research program for the United States government, we didn't come to a consensus on that. But we did say that given that we believe that no research is happening now, it most likely will continue in the future from some parties in the public or private sector, then the question is what kind of steps towards governance can be taken right now. And so to that degree, it's agnostic about the prudence of SRM, and I think successful in setting a tone with respect to that. We come up with 4 main objectives to governance and 12 recommendations. I'm just going to show you those quickly. We'll talk more in detail about them in the course of our conversation. So the 4 overall objectives of governance, which framed our thinking on what we needed to try to aspire to create in the 12 recommendations. First of all, as I said before, keep mitigation and adaptation first. Core principle for all the authors of this report, and we think is solidly, I think, within the mainstream of the research community on SRM now. Secondly, thoroughly and transparently evaluate the risks, benefits, and burdens of SRM. Makes sense, given what we talked about earlier in terms of the very complicated matrix of burdens and benefits, not only of doing the research, potential deployment, but also the threat of climate change. Thirdly, enable responsible knowledge creation. All too often, if you're not a governance geek like me and other authors of the report, we think of governance as necessarily the thing that restrains innovation, that sets a burden on creativity, that holds people back from doing something. But that's certainly not what it's designed to do in the best circles of science and technology policy, but in actually to enable responsible knowledge creation, responsible to whom? In this case, responsible to people, to the public, because we're not talking about some bucket of research that's done just because it's really nifty to see if you could release calcium carbonate calcium carbonate into the stratosphere and, run some machines through it and kind of see whether you can track the particles. It's not just a sort of advance in atmospheric chemistry and physics, though that experiment will contribute to that base knowledge, but really to sort of figure out whether or not you could eventually produce something that can contribute to the public good of responding to climate change. And so it has to be responsible in the broadest sense. And finally, to ensure robust governance before there's any consideration of deployment at all. Now, the three clusters of recommendations we came to, which the 12 fall under, are firstly creating politically legitimate deliberative bodies, secondly leveraging existing institutions of governance, and finally making research transparent and accountable. I'm just going to show you these. You can flip through in your book and we'll talk about some of them in general, but explain the three categories by showing you the list that we came up under each one of them, and I won't talk through each one of these recommendations. So why create politically legitimate deliberative bodies? And here, this is, I would sort of say, again, me personally speaking, this might be one of the more controversial buckets because it would be the biggest lift, I believe, to establish first some kind of world commission on SRM and a global forum for people, a stakeholder dialogue on SRM. Now, why do this? One reason is because we think that in order to move forward with governance, you need to create politically legitimate bodies. There's any number of reports. National Academies is now convening a panel for another report on SRM. But what is it that's going to actually tie these different bodies saying different things together to try to move forward? It may be too much to ask for there to be a World Commission just on SRM, but certainly the cluster of emerging technologies around climate response measures might require something like this. And Genevieve, I know, can say a lot about how the UN system has moved through this kind of process of convening high-level panels of eminent persons on one thing or another before they actually get down to the brass tacks of talking about some methodology or some system of governance. But there's a practical issue here as well. Some of the most controversial issues on governance, I'll just name a couple, whether or not we need a moratorium on research or deployment right now, whether or not we need to be thinking about some kind of restrictions on patents on something. Again, a technology not just being done because it's interesting technology, but because it contributes to a global public good. We felt that those were not the kinds of questions that our group was going to try to answer, because we would offer a well-informed opinion, I'm sure, about what the outcome of that should be, but really where the momentum should be would be some globally legitimate body to try to actually do the hard work for making a recommendation to the global community on important issues like that. So those are the first two sort of chapeau notions there. And I should say, incidentally, as I work through the next two slides, and then we'll move to the panel, we don't at all believe that this is a one package, you've got to accept the whole thing or nothing, go home. We're not encouraging people to pull out only the ones that they're happy with and discard the ones that make them feel a little uneasy, but it certainly is the case that some of these could be moved forward without the others. Secondly, and this is where we could, I think, more easily move forward in the near term, and I should say that all these recommendations were considered to be effectively in the near term, by which we defined as 5 to 10 years out. So, and we went through lots of debate on this about, like, should we have 3 sets of recommendations at 3 different scales, local, regional, and global, near term, medium term, long term. It was enough, we thought, just to try to get out the 12 we thought were essential for the near term. That, of course, is a timeline that most likely would not consider any potential deployment scenarios, at least none that I think that would be well researched and understood, that you actually control whatever you were trying to do to the environment to get some kind of temperature response, but nonetheless would be ones that would lay the groundwork for future deployment down the road. So these 4 really focus on existing institutions, just to take a couple here. The first one, strengthening cooperation between international organizations. There are many who would argue that, of course, an issue like SRM should go right into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I have my own personal views why I think that would not be the right first move for that, why it structurally doesn't fit with UNFCCC. But what we surely know is that given all of the environmental global conventions that we have out there, some of which have already moved forward to try to take some kind of stand on governance issues on SRM, like the Convention on Biodiversity, we need more coordination between them. And then the second one there, number 4, assess and improve capacity for regional coordination and conflict resolution. Here we're focusing on the necessity of smaller multilateral organizations such as the Arctic Council, such as ASEAN, such as the regional, when we start thinking about a potential technological pathway for moving forward with this technology, it might begin with potential regional impacts before it gets to a global scale. And we think that those kinds of organizations need to be engaged from an early standpoint, rather than later. Already there have been some calls for limited climate engineering on the Arctic. For example, we would imagine that the Arctic Council would need to get engaged on the governance side of that sooner rather than later. And then finally, the biggest bucket, which is making research transparent and accountable. And this included things like including research and development activities on SRM in the global stocktake measure under the Paris Agreement, something we can talk at length about later, which is the mechanism which is supposed to constantly inform the world on not only what is the state of mitigation and adaptation around the world, but also, hopefully, we'll see this year how it resolves itself, but also potentially give an update on what countries are doing with respect to R&D activities. Clarifying funding streams, number 10 is a good one there. There's an awful lot of climate engineering research that's already happened in the United States, but it doesn't fall under a title of solar radiation management in any NSF directorate. We need to be able to clarify and daylight streams like this so that people can know what's being done in order to create greater forms of accountability and transparency across the board. And this includes, again, the last 3 really, that goes very closely with number 11, developing some kind of globally public clearinghouse. You can find out what research is going on around the world. Okay, so I'll stop there. We want to thank our funders who have supported this project from the beginning, the V.K. Rasmussen Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the Open Philanthropy Project. And now we'll start with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I'd like to invite our panelists to come up to the front and join us. And thank you, Andrew, very much for that very clear, clarion call for transparency and accountability. As a journalist, a member of the media, that is critically important to have more, not less, dialogue about these complicated things. Even at times, it might be complicated to talk about them. And also, kudos to the editors of the report for these very clear and consistent recommendations. Having done that role myself, I know how hard it can be to organize 14 people and their different disagreements and to produce something like this. So it's a real remarkable achievement. Now we'll turn it over to Walter for his comments.
Thank you.
It's
Should I turn it on?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it was. I suppose green is on. Yes. Thank you. Very briefly, I'd like to comment on the governance approach that is that has motivated the sort of thinking that we did in the report, which is anticipatory governance. And it has guided all the recommendations, but you could look, for instance, at the first group that Andrew described as a product of this thinking. So let me first tell you why anticipatory governance matter and why it's an original approach to governance. There are 2 general dispositions to manage the emergence of technologies at the earliest stage of the life of technologies. It's very uncertain what are their effects on general society, on the groups impacted, even how they work. They are marred with heavy uncertainty. And the usual disposition is, let's first understand exactly what are the effects before we even start thinking about managing them. The problem is that many of the technologies emerge and are adopted massively before that understanding can be even achieved. You need extensive data and evidence to even get close to a correlational understanding of cause and effect, much less established causality. of the emergence of new technologies. So we face what it's known as the Coleridge dilemma. The Coleridge dilemma says that at an early stage of the development of a new technology, we know very little, but we have the opportunity or the ability to shape the development of this technology. And then later down the path of adoption and implementation in society, the technology becomes more unwieldy to control or management, even though we now know more about the effects of it. So anticipatory governance is a way to escape the Coleridge dilemma. It's a way to say, well, we don't need to know in advance the detail or establish clear causality, and then just wait to see what happens until we have that knowledge. We can take action before this happens that will help us manage the future. And that disposition is to build capacity to deal with this, with whatever effects, whatever consequences could emerge from it. There are different techniques or different approaches to this, all of them perhaps valid. But just to give you an example is to imagine the future scenarios of things that could happen and use this imagination to develop the societal capacities to deal with the circumstances. Not because these imagined scenarios are forecasts of any accuracy, but they develop, if you want, the societal muscle to deal with consequences. Another usual tendency in administration and management of emerging technology and its consequences is simply crisis management, develop the capacities to deal with crisis. But the problem with some of this technology, and consider this one of it, is the huge cost of managing unintended consequences. It's almost unthinkable. So you also do not want to wait for crises to happen to manage and pay the costs, maybe even unaffordable at this scale. So again, anticipatory governance is a disposition that thinks of there are things that we could do now to anticipate and prepare for different scenarios that prevent the most extreme circumstances. So this disposition that I'm calling anticipatory governance, you will be able to read through the report, and it guides or informs some of our prescriptions. And I'll just redirect it to the first group, which is to create politically legitimate bodies. And it is that within the spirit of anticipatory governance, one of the key questions is, what is a legitimate decision? And at the global scale would be, what is a legitimate decision to hack the planet's climate? And that is a decision that clearly involves the peoples and the nations of all over the world. So our first recommendation, we start from saying, well, we need to create this space in which we can invite the different peoples and nations of the world, and particularly those excluded traditionally from decision making, to have a say in what do they want with respect to this gigantic project. And we have split that recommendation to levels: one, creating the forum that would invite this diversity of opinions, and second, to have a high-level commission that will be informed by the deliberations of the forum. With that, I think I have my five minutes, and leave you with that the approach of anticipatory governance that you will see through the report.
Thank you very much, Walter. I think that's important to focus not only, as you said, on anticipatory governments, but also how to make it inclusive. Anticipatory governments is an additional part of the challenge. Now we turn over to Paul for his remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's very nice to be here, and thank you, Megan. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Genevieve. So I was on the working group, and I thought I would use my time just to give you a sense of what it was like to be on the working group. It was one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever done. Seriously. It was an intellectual sort of challenge that I don't think I've sort of weathered yet. And I'll sort of just give you a sense of that by saying that, so I'm a professor at American University. Simon and David are colleagues of mine. And I teach a course on global environmental politics. And a typical global environmental politics course is sort of introduction to doom. You start off with, loss of biological diversity, climate change, ozone depletion, so forth. And when I introduced geoengineering, it was the first time that people started smiling in class. And I had students who were really excited. And the more they got excited, the more I got even more uncomfortable. And what was going on is that I was starting to squirm from sort of an ethics perspective. For me, the ethics of geoengineering seemed pretty straightforward. As Walter said, you don't hack the planet. Let's start there. You don't hack the planet. You don't take mastery to the level of the Earth itself. We've mastered so many things in our immediate lives, and it seems like one consequence is that we've just sort of have now sort of global spasm globally because of our efforts. And but more importantly, not just not hack the planet, but in the sense of playing God and so forth, but more importantly, this moral hazard that, as Andrew pointed out, this kind of risk issue with regard in governance is that as one pushes toward even legitimizing geoengineering, then in fact, many people will start to say, well, mitigation, let's switch to this and let's forget about mitigation. And Andrew said, no one really believes that, but in fact, that slippery slope is very much alive. And it's going to increasingly get alive as people digest the latest IPCC report. So the ethics seem pretty straightforward, but in fact, when warming, when we go through, as we continue to go through this portal of intensification, I think the ethics get a lot trickier. Is it for those, for example, on the front lines who've had the least responsibility for the problem, as they start to suffer more and more? Are we going to be able to say simply mitigation, and recognize the limitations of that mitigation effort? I think it's going to be much more difficult. So throughout the project, I was sort of in this yes, no place with this, and the working group came out agnostic on whether to deploy or not. But the one thing we did fully agree on is, and it's kind of basic, but to even have that choice, you need governance. To be able to work out the moral argument, you need stakeholders who are coordinated in meaningful ways so that there can be reflection and ultimately regulatory or market forces or some type of organizing principle to work through these things. Right now, it's the Wild West in terms of governance with regard to geoengineering. We're certainly talking about anticipatory governance, but it seems that there's a need very much right now, again, to work through these risk issues and the report sort of speaks to that. I was thinking about this with regard to President Trump's recent announcement that he wants to leave the INF Treaty. And yes, there's evidence that the Russians are cheating, but scrap the treaty and it's sort of like we're starting from square one in many ways. And the opportunity, one could sort of flip it in terms of geoengineering. Let's have some instruments on the ground. Let's have some, again, coordinating systems so that we don't have just a blank slate. The challenge for the group was then sort of, okay, what does that look like? And I just found it intellectually fascinating to sort of think about governance and ways in which we can knit together existing institutions, but then also think about new ones as well. My hope for this report is that it sort of highlights, that encourages engagement, I guess, that encourages us to take this seriously. We have disruptive technologies have come historically, and historically we seem to sort of respond to them rather than actually guide them. This is a potentially extraordinarily disruptive technology, and our ability to kind of get out in front of it is seems to me it's going to be quite meaningful. The report is not a blueprint. It doesn't, as Andrew said, it doesn't all come as a package, but I think there's pieces in there that make, that there's sort of low-hanging fruit, and then there's sort of more ambitious efforts. And my hope for the report is that it will encourage people to, encourage intellectuals to dig deeper into the governance issue. This is part of now a train of reports, like there's the Oxford Principles, which actually also try to set some parameters around how to think about this. And my hope is that it will do that intellectually, but at the governance side, those in existing institutions will start to see the responsibility that comes with this issue, and those at the visionary level of governance will also engage as well. So yeah, and I think sadly, Andrew's right. It's not like there's anything out there right now that we have to govern but the IPCC report, it seems like every single report reading says this is not just on the horizon, this is on sort of more and more the immediate horizon. So I think there's a sense of urgency of which this report speaks to. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. It's really, I think, to the report's credit that the ethical concerns were foregrounded so much in the process. And kudos for being comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think if more of us were to do that more often, we'd be more successful. Now I turn it over to Genevieve for her reflections.
Great. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for just for having me here, but I think also for giving me the opportunity to dig into this a bit more, because despite having worked in the climate space for a while, these issues are actually not ones that I grapple with on not even a daily basis, on an any day basis. And so it was fascinating to dig into the report and see what you've done, and to start reflecting on sort of how one would do this right, kind of from the outset. So I think, first of all, I just think you all very much are to be commended for embarking on this and for raising the questions that we all need to be sort of struggling with. I think, this is an issue where governance is especially challenging, because it doesn't follow a model of many of the other things that have been in the global space around this. It is this weird hybrid between sort of needing to govern research and development, but also needing to govern action, and those two things effectively are happening at the same time sometimes when you're doing research and development. So you can't sort of siphon this off, or push this off to the side and say, this is just an R&D issue. So you definitely do need sort of key government actors and key others to be part of the conversation, but it's strange in that you can't just have an exclusively sort of governments talking to one another, because of the nature of the question, and because it is fundamentally about about how you enact and think about science. So that hybrid poses a number of key questions, and I think it's key questions that make the effort sort of puts the onus on a more thoughtful process, I suppose, than can be done in sort of a more traditional UN kind of setting. I think that I actually think that in response to that, there's sort of, there are key how questions and key where questions. So I think to start with the how, I think some of your later recommendations are sort of in that space, and I think there's a lot that came out of the, 7 through 12, I think, of the recommendations that talk about inclusivity and how you sort of make sure that you're representing developing country voices at the same time. The concept of interdisciplinarity seems to me a very key one. The idea of bringing in multiple perspectives, not just from academia, but from every corner of society that will be affected by this. The question of transparency and how you make the where funding comes from a key and open process, but also the how of doing research. That seems fundamental to something like this, especially where the effort is about, where trust building is absolutely essential. And then I think just the general call for norm setting and sort of setting a code of conduct seems a very wise path, a wise thing to do sort of from the outset. Now, I think the question of where you do these things is a lot more difficult. And I know that where you came out in the first two recommendations was in a sort of UN body who could sort of wrestle with these things. And I think probably the reason that I was asked to speak to this is because I spent some time at within the context of the UN, working for the U.S. ambassador to the UN and wrestling with questions that tend to fall in this. I was going to say trickier, but really the Security Council is quite tricky as well. But the especially tricky General Assembly side of the UN, where there are a lot of voices at play, and so any issue that you tackle that relates to evidence or that relates to trying to get better knowledge is inherently constrained by the fact that you are in one of the most political settings imaginable. And so I think that applies very much to sort of how the initial recommendation would play out and how you might want to sort of continue to tailor your recommendations as you sort of go forward. Because I think we do have examples of, great examples, I think, of the Secretary General appointing a body of 14 to 20 experts from around the world who cover lots of different sort of segments of an issue, and coming up with recommendations. So I very much understand the reason for putting that, very centrally. I think the idea of having a deliberative group of experts who can really do this with the support of, with a sort of high level enough stage, and the support of many different entities so that they can actually put recommendations on the table that are taken seriously, I think that's very valuable in concept. I think that's incredibly hard to implement in practice. And I think one example of sort of, that Andrew knows quite well of how this was attempted recently was with within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals before they were negotiated. Several years before they were negotiated, there was a high-level panel of eminent persons that the Secretary General set up with representatives from all different sort of sectors, but representing many different countries from around the world. They deliberated and came up with a report that I think several of us see to be still the high watermark for what a good set of global goals would look like. I think it was, it sort of did a lot of what you would want an entity, a world commission, to do, in that it looked at sort of a lot of the evidence that existed about what you could actually accomplish over 15 years globally, and also, I think, did try and incorporate politics into what they were thinking about. So that report came out. It was a great report. It was politicized from the first minute that it came out, and it was politicized to the last day, to the point where we could not refer to it in negotiations. And not just in negotiations, which is already a very political and highly charged place, but in the Sustainable Development Goals process, they had this very unique thing in the evidence-free zone of the United Nations, of a year and a half, which were not negotiations, that were focused, this open working group on sustainable development, which was fundamentally focused on creating an interactive discussion space at the UN where you could actually look at the evidence on the table. And in that context, where we were not negotiating anything, there was nothing, nobody was going to sort of, at the end of that process, bring the world leaders in and sign off on anything. And even there, we couldn't refer to the high-level panel report, because it was too political and it was seen to be this was extremely diverse in terms of who was included on it. It was inherently representative of voices from the developing and developed countries, because that was the nature of what we were trying to tackle. And it was held up as a developed country product in order to sort of delegitimize it and enable the process to be more political. So I think the lesson of that is that no matter how well you craft the body, you will inherently be in the context of politics if you go into the UN setting. And I think there are ways of doing it that sort of could work. But I think it is worth thinking about, especially, I very much take the point that the report puts out, that the IPCC is fundamentally an assessment body, and so it doesn't quite hit the mark on this either. But sort of to the point I was sort of trying to make initially, where the issue itself is a bit of a hybrid between research and action, the committee has to be one too. And so we don't necessarily have institutions that set you up for the right place to consider this. But it seems like a blend between what the IPCC offers and what sort of a high-level Secretary General panel offers is really what you're looking for. And the how you create space for that is a bit of a question mark. And I think it's one that is worth sort of batting around a bit before landing, I think, on ultimately who the right target is to lobby for this, right? Is it the Secretary General, or is it the head of the IPCC, or is it somebody else? And I think that's something that I think is worth discussing. What could sort of go best there? So a few other very quick points, and then I will stop talking. On the stakeholder forum, I think this is a fundamentally important point that you make, and I think it has to be part of any process. But a thing that is tricky in this space is that you might have people in your classes who have this enthusiasm that comes from a sort of gut reaction. I think the problem is we're all operating in gut reactions right now, or too many of us are operating on our gut reaction to what we should do with the planet or what we shouldn't. And it's all this very, it's either very conceptual or very much from the heart and not necessarily from the brain, from an informed place. So it's a stakeholder forum, I think, is fundamentally important to anticipatory governance for new technologies. But the how you do that is also incredibly difficult, because people have to be informed in order to give their input in a meaningful way. And sort of the how you get them informed before holding a forum is just, it's something that is non-trivial, and it is something that I think it's worth us sort of talking about much more robustly before we move forward into that, because you could easily set up a stakeholder forum that ends up backfiring. So I think the terms of that, I think you have a guide towards the terms of that in how you sort of, the how points, again, the 7 through 12 recommendations, because all of those have to be part of the stakeholder forum idea. But again, I think that's one of the most important and most difficult to implement. So just some thoughts that I think cover a range of issues that you've tackled, but I really do just want to end with saying, I think just opening this conversation and raising these questions moves us so far down the road, so that we can actually start to think about the way you put this more centrally into the minds of people who are probably inadvertently making decisions without realizing it every day. That's what we're going to do here. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Genevieve. It's a great insight into institutional and political processes and the importance of considering the sequencing and getting the timing right as we move forward. Now we're going to open it up for questions. We have a good amount of time thanks to our panelists here. And there's microphones, I believe, for the questions, so please wait for the microphone. When you get the microphone, please provide your name and your affiliation. And please remember to ask a question, not give a speech. Thank you.
I'm Chuck Weiss. I'm retired from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I was scientific advisor to the World Bank for a long time, for 15 years. I'll try to make these questions. One of the features of geoengineering is that it's uniquely susceptible to rogue states and to very wealthy individuals. And I wonder whether your committee has thought about that. Secondly, the nearest thing to this combination of formal and informal development of norms that I know about was the stakeholder conference connected with the governance of the net that culminated in the Tunis summit of 2005, which had all the messiness that Ms. Genevieve described. Now, this is different from what we're talking about. This was eventually ended up legitimizing a system that was working, even though it had no legitimate structure. And that brings me to my third question. I wonder if you consider that in your deliberations. This brings me to my third point, that given the sclerosis of most of our existing institutions, if there are other possible sources of norms. And the major point of your report, as I read it, is that you're trying to create and to effect or legitimize and put into practice norms of practice, which is very valuable. But there are other possible sources. Think of the talent principles for the net. Think of professional norms. There are a lot of other places where these norms could be developed and could percolate upward and then eventually emerge as treaties or as judicial decisions or whatever. And I would be glad to have the thoughts of the panel on this.
Since that's a three-parter, let's go ahead and take it, and feel free to answer whichever parts of it you're interested in responding to. Paul, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll speak to the first point about not just... Yeah, I'd like to speak to the first point. Great questions, by the way. The question you talked about, could a rogue state sort of co-opt this? And we discussed both that scenario, but also sort of commercial capture as well. I mean, this is a technology that's lending itself to capture in many different ways. I remember Richard Falk he used to talk about the Monsanto piece of this. And so in the report, I mean, in fact, in so many of the specific recommendations, there's an attempt to, through transparency, through stakeholder engagement, through the daylighting of research and so forth, there is an attempt to guard against that. Is it, nothing in the report sort of offers a fail-safe measure here, but it very much informed the kind of conversations we've had. And I would just say, again, it was the emphasis on cracking open even the funding stream. And it's difficult because some of the things we talk about are going to be very difficult to implement, but to have a clearinghouse so that we actually know from funding to research to any kind of thinking about deployment, that those things are publicly able to be scrutinized. I'll let some other colleagues speak to that part.
Yeah, let me just add to that. So I think that certainly if we ever got to the deployment of something that had a temperature response, we've got enough stuff in the sky that would pick that up. So the idea of a rogue deployment that happened and then something, I mean, that's not it's wouldn't ever want to sort of say it wouldn't be possible, but it would certainly be difficult, as would many of the steps along the way, right, to getting to the point where you would have a deployable thing that could have some kind of temperature response. But so there is sort of a sense in which our information gathering capacities will overlap quite nicely with respect to climate change, will overlap quite nicely with tracking some of those concerns. But some of the particular recommendations that we have are designed to not only put parties in a position where they are strongly encouraged, if not required, because of some other agreement they're going to be part of, to report, but also to put more watchdogs on them. And this is one of the reasons, that we put the global stock take recommendation is actually not under leveraging existing institutions, but we moved it to making research transparent and accountable, because that's the point of that recommendation, is that if you actually, and I realize there are some people who are uncomfortable with this recommendation, happy to talk about it, but well, on one hand, people might worry, well, if countries are reporting on SRM as part of what they're reporting in terms of what they're doing with respect to the Paris Agreement, this might legitimize activity that would, sanction them from pulling back from their mitigation responsibilities. I'm less worried about that. I'm more interested in the idea that if you're actually encouraging parties to report on how they're moving forward with this technology, then it gives us a better sense of what countries are doing so we know where to aim the eyes of the watchdogs. Could you still do something in secret? Of course you could. But nonetheless, I think this plus some of the other recommendations would do that. On the, and I'd sort of say in terms of the wealthy individuals there, we struggle with, certainly national governments can pass laws requiring that they have clearinghouses and lists and accessible databases of what research is being done on SRM, so officially designated SRM programs. We think that any country that's funding SRM should label it as such. We also argue that anything that's applicable to SRM, even if it's not directly on SRM, should be tagged in research databases. Of course, leaves you with the problem of private individuals and foundations that might not fall under the same kind of requirements in many countries. And there, it's sort of almost like a Sullivan Principles approach, right, from South Africa, to go back to sort of the moratorium on investment in South Africa. We want to create peer pressure among funding organizations and wealthy individuals that they require up front that the people that are their recipients who are doing research under the guise of SRM are, one, making it public, and two, signing on to some acceptable code of conduct. And so we sort of argue, like, you've got to start from that voluntary, like, set of standards there, that if there's, you know, I don't want to name you know, any particular, a few who are investing heavily in the upcoming in the elections next week come to mind. So I'm tempted to say Sheldon Adelson or Tom Steyer, but I won't say that, although I just did. But pick your favorite example. Someone decides like they're not going to bankroll a particular candidate for president. We're going to put all their resources right into technology of this sort. We want to be able to know as soon as we find out they are investing in that, whether or not there is some kind of requirement there for reporting, for transparency, and whether or not there's some adherence to some kind of code of conduct. And I should sort of say that for those of you who don't follow this as closely as we have been for the last couple of years, and thanks to Genevieve for teeing this up, the debates over code of conduct in the scientific community are very well advanced on this. And one of our friends and colleagues, Anna Maria Hilbert from the Law School at the University of Calgary, has, I think, produced one of the most interesting ones, and we flag it in our recommendation on codes of conduct. And I think that answers your third question, Charles, which is that in terms of norms, absolutely, a lot of this has got to be done in the initial stages as self-organized by the scientific community doing the experiments themselves. And if you don't have that buy-in from the beginning, it's going to be really difficult to get them to accept it further down the stream. And I think that some of the people who are proposing experiments on the ground now well see that as something that they've got to get in front of before they face a public backlash, an uninformed public backlash against the kind of stuff that they're doing.
Walter, did you want to add anything?
I'll leave it there.
Okay.
I'll pick up the next.
Next question.
My name is John Topping with the Climate Institute. I have essentially what might be an argumentative question to some extent. I applaud what you're doing. I think given what we're facing, we may be far too cautious. And I appreciate very much what Genevieve has to say, but I think to some extent we're going to have to go with deployment right away on a continuum with SRM as part of a broader aggressive strategy. We can look, for example, at certain things that should be non-controversial but are still SRM, which would be painting roofs white, for example, changing albedo that way, reducing urban heat island effects. Some things that are a combination of climate adaptation. This could involve bright bubbles, micro bubbles that could essentially reduce evaporation from reservoirs, helping climate change that way. And then they move on to the continuum, which could include sea salt in the Arctic to essentially brighten clouds and so on. And I think in the end, if we're not going to have a dystopian situation by the time my 6 grandkids, and the oldest is 7, are essentially my age, that we're going to need a strategy which involves aggressive change in energy systems, agricultural systems, carbon storage in the soils, and SRM. And I wonder whether those of you who've looked at this could buy into the notion of combining climate adaptation with this SRM strategy to make this acceptable. So it's not seen as some huge leap, from the present, which would result in this being filibustered for ages in the international process, and essentially some of the worst situations of 4-degree or 5-degree rise in temperature above pre-industrial happening by about 2080.
Could you pass it to the gentleman in front of you, and we'll take a couple questions at once. Thank you.
Thank you. Ilan Chabai, Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany, and ASU here. My question is whether, especially given the reflections of Genevieve just now, and which I found very interesting and helpful, but I've been engaged in various ways with efforts at a much more granular level, and the question is whether progress can be made in really bringing, number one, in informing people, engaging people in understanding what's involved, and in these kind of stakeholder dialogues, but where there really is the opportunity to have a much broader base of stakeholders between those with a lot of power and access and knowledge and so forth, and those who don't, but whose lives are at risk in this. I'm thinking about work that my institute does, for example, with Pacific Island states and things like that. The question is, do you see the opportunity to, in a sense, build a basis on a much smaller, granular level that can be then scaled in some sense, or brought together? It also, in some sense, connects to the question of changing the norms, because if there is both the professional cohort in that and civil society more broadly, that too changes who's involved, including faith-based communities, etc. I mean, there are many different ways one might go about that, but I would be very interested in your thoughts on this. Thank you.
So 2 questions, one about climate adaptation and SRM, and another on the engaging at the more granular level. Who'd like to start? Stumpers.
Please, if you have. Well, one thing on the last question, at some point, Dan or someone from ASU should describe the project you're doing right now, which I think fits the bill on that. Which is a stakeholder process, which is already had two. I think you had 2 sessions in the fall. One in Arizona and one in Boston, right? Which is actually trying to bring together small groups of sets of members of the community to educate them. I mean, not in a pedantic way, but sort of increase their awareness of this technology, the suite of technologies and solutions and the complicated risk scenarios, and then allow them to go through their own process. I think that the question is always going to be the degree to which we could ever potentially scale that up to some kind of threshold level where it would count as enough people having gone through a process like that to be, register as making our decisions better. But I don't know that that matters too much, as long as you actually do have that kind of capacity. The other thing I would sort of say, I think, look, I sort of made a bit of a joke of it, but I think it was actually a virtue of the group that we had very strong levels of disagreement in the room about what we thought the risks were, what we thought was the prudence in engaging in research on this technology, the potential necessity for deployment, and I don't want to characterize anyone's views in particular, but I think that's probably created a kind of a strength for this report in the end, is that all of us nonetheless were able to agree on these 12 recommendations, even with some of us were saying we shouldn't even be we should have a moratorium on the research now. And so I think that is because people were willing to engage in the counterfactual. Well, if research scales up, regardless of what your personal view on it, then what measures would you like to see in place, either at a voluntary level or required by government? So I'm very much sympathetic to the view that you just characterized in terms of absolutely starting with stuff that's painted roofs white, all the sort of artificial albedo stuff that we can do that's not potentially environmentally invasive and which we can control, seeing those on a spectrum, and reporting it right within the well worked out parameters of the Cancun adaptation framework. I also think that there's lots of very interesting proposals now, that in terms of how we sort of think about response measures to the emerging conversation and the Framework Convention on Loss and Damage might require us to eventually sort of engage, in thinking about these kinds of technologies. But at a certain point, of course, we're talking about, as soon as we start talking about transboundary effects in particular, or any kind of intervention which potentially threaten, especially more vulnerable communities, that's certainly a place where you hope that you've got some governance out in front of it, which can pause and think about the potential risk trade-offs involved in those kinds of issues. But this is a kind of a view that I have. I personally, again, just speaking personally, think that that these kinds of, the discussion of these technologies needs to be mainstreamed into the climate discussion, not set off on the side. That's my personal view. That's not a view that the other members, authors of the report, had to sign on in order to agree to these recommendations. So it's consistent with, these recommendations consistent with that view, and also consistent with the view which actually I think would be, draw a harder line, right, between these different kinds of things. And I think that is potentially a virtue of the report, at least as looking at these recommendations as a starting point for a good discussion.
Paul, you want to add something? Or Genevieve?
Just mine's quite a small point. I mean, I do think that your question about sort of the granular engagement, I think, is a really good one and an important one, because I think we have a model for how this can work, obviously, in what you're doing right here, but I think also in there are other UN processes where you go and talk to small groups of farmers who have no idea, I mean, literally no idea about what the broader discourse is at a global level, and they don't need to, because you're talking about the particular pieces of it that relate to them and their lives. This is a slightly different circumstance than that, but I think there are ways of providing information and getting feedback that can go deeper than just how does this feel to you in a gut level, you know. So I think it's a great idea.
I would just add on the second question, the report itself, I actually think serves as an educative role. If you read the report, it's not just a set of recommendations, but it actually brings one up to date on sort of where the conversation is. And I think that I would hope actually it plays that role. I wonder about this question about folding this into adaptation and making it sort of more palatable. And get some legs on it and so forth. And the working group was, I mean, I would say we were very torn on that. But it seems that there's something unique about these technologies that at least for me, and I'm not speaking for the working group here, that make them distinct. And that, I mean, if we do SRM technologies, we basically have to do it forever, unless we get our Mitigation Act together. And that strikes me as a little bit different than working on sort of the albedo effect and so forth. I guess I would love to ask Andrew a question, if it's okay. Andrew, are you comfortable with, you said that, you know, to mainstream this?
Yeah.
It would, putting this under the rubric of adaptation, would that, is that comfortable to you? Is that a form of mainstreaming as you understand it?
I think finding as many ways in which we can sort of make sure that we understand what parties are doing is the thing to do. If we have to shoehorn it into one part or another of the various different international conventions that do that, is a good route within reason. So especially when we're talking about painting roofs white, like I just think that's markedly different than many of the examples we were thinking about when we're thinking about. We don't need codes of conduct for people painting roofs white, right? We do need some regulations that make people paint their roofs white. But that's, of course, the challenge in discussions over these technologies, because we're talking about a future that doesn't yet exist, of really capturing some recommendation that looks at the full range of them. But here's where you and I disagree on some things. Like, I don't think that if you did SRM, you'd have to do it forever. I think you could do it. There's very interesting literature out there about the limited uses of SRM to slow the pace of temperature change, rather than try to dial to a certain knob and then stop there, but to slow the pace in order to bring about greater levels of mitigation, eventually hitting particular technology thresholds that we're going to need in order to hit our end of the century climate targets, if they're at all going to be consistent with Paris. Now, that would require an enormous amount of coordination to do something for a limited amount of time and then dial it down, and then so that you can ramp up mitigation. It definitely means that people can't go, okay, well, we've got a response, and so now we're off and running, and we're going to commit to that basket. And that's difficult to imagine doing, impossible to imagine doing without some kind of level of global governments. And I'm less worried about the kind of the slippery slope issues in terms, especially on the research agenda, because I think, look, mitigation. Thank God there are private markets that are working quite well to get clean energy technologies spread throughout the world, and I think we'll be accelerating in helping to move those things along. But still, we're talking about just the accepted targets for climate finance right now is $100 billion annually from 2020 moving forward. That's our 2009 Copenhagen target. You don't need any significant portion of that to get a robust, concentrated research program on one or another of these suites of technologies off the ground. And so I don't think there's going to be a competition either in terms of time or money to move that along. But again, that's the virtue of this report, is that by those of you views, you may disagree, and yet we agree on these recommendations.
I also just want to invite Simon and David to join the panel if you'd like, because I know you've thought about this a lot. Or just jump in when there's a question that feels relevant. Okay, yeah.
Great, right here.
So I'm Amanda Stout from the National Academy of Sciences, and my team is the one that did the climate intervention report in 2015, and we're doing the next report on solar geoengineering as well. So we're very interested in this report. Congratulations, we know how hard it is to do these kinds of projects, and this is going to be really useful to us going forward. So I have two questions. One is kind of getting at, following on to the conversation we just had. So the report presents the things where the panel agreed. I'm kind of curious where the panel had major areas of disagreement, mostly to inform us as we go forward. What are the things that we should be kind of thinking about and preparing to address as we go forward? And then my second question is, there are a lot of recommendations in this report. Did the panel give any thought to the sequencing of, should we be going after some of these things first or later, or all of them at the same time? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll offer a few thoughts to shed some light on the disagreement that we tried to cover. But let me begin by saying that while the disagreement existed in the same way as Andrew and Paul presented it, intense and extensive, for me the pleasure of participating in the group was the degree of civility by which we would listen to other people's reasoning. And in 2.5 years and 5 meetings, I learned from the people who disagree with me a lot. Maybe I arrived to different conclusions, likely I arrived to different conclusions than other members of the group, but I didn't arrive to the same conclusions or preconceptions to which I started the exercise. I say that to show that the disagreements or the areas of disagreement are not reasons not to have a wide-ranging dialogue or modify our beliefs. But here's one example of an area of disagreement to answer your question specifically, which is this. I would say some way of thinking about the problem is, or has been presented as, to deploy, we need to know more about the engineering of the artifacts that will deploy this object. Is it going to be a balloon or a modified 747? What kind of nozzle the spray will have? What kind of can we carry this payload up into space? And a number of engineering questions. More difficult, larger questions. The science of the particles and the refractivity and how they increase the albedo. You can imagine that there's a whole agenda of research questions to be answered, and so it has. A line of thinking has presented this way. Before we take a step to deployment, we really need to know these details. And to do that, we need to advance research gradually from modeling into the laboratory, into the field. At some point, you cross the threshold from completely innocuous field research to research that will start tinkering with the climate. But they present this as the more you know the science, the more responsibly you advance into the future. We don't know yet how the physics and chemistry and engineering constraints will work. So solve the riddle, untangle that knot, you can move forward responsibly, right? Another group of people thinking about this problem from the governance perspective take a different angle, which is start from the end position. Start from the point in which you really build up a legitimate international infrastructure for deployment. You really magically put the nations aligned so that neither of the nations with the resources to do this deployment in a sustained fashion really will be in disagreement. Imagine the ideal scenario and try to build back what took us there. And when you start at that point, you start seeing the Gordian knot in a different place. Is political order of nations and a political economy underlying the decisions to allow for that to happen. The size of that Gordian knot, for many, seems proportionally or disproportionately much larger than the size of the Gordian knot of scientific knowledge, which is the knowledge that we first should have. I don't think the group ever sorted out that question. We agree that there needs to be some governance infrastructure, but then you can start thinking the amount of disagreement that this question. Do we really need to start knowing more about the science and the engineering if the real Gordian knot is entirely elsewhere? That sort of thinking. Maybe my co-panelists will have other points in which we never agreed on.
So I'd say just a few issues that I think, just quickly. I mean, one is there was an agreement on the panel about the larger, let's just say, existential questions about whether or not it is the right thing for humans to be trying to manipulate the planet. Some people sort of, well, we're already doing an experiment, it's called climate change. And other people are saying, no, there's a red line here. This is sui generis, kind of different in terms of a potential intentional intervention. And it's good that we didn't have to settle those issues, because I think it would have been very difficult for this group to move forward if we decided we had to settle them in order to move forward. And so I think that's helpful that we were all aimed at producing recommendations on governance, which allowed people, again, to consider the counterfactual, whatever their views were. Secondly, couldn't agree on whether or not we wanted to promote, actively encourage governments to engage in research in SRM. No agreement there, don't have a set of recommendations there. Thirdly, I think that we could not come to an agreement on whether or not it was adequate for, whether or not when you're talking about field tests, specifically not field experiments which potentially would generate a temperature response, but field tests where you're just putting something out there to measure some part of what will eventually be a deployable thing, the degree to which you would need to necessarily change existing, say take the most robust in the world environmental health and safety regulations, you need to change those or augment them to accommodate something like that, or whether or not you could go ahead and move forward with those kinds of tests without that. And the last recommendation kind of struggles kind of openly, I think, with that tension, and then comes to, well, look, this is where we've kind of reached the limits of what we can say on this, so that this is a question that people who do a lot more with respect to these regulations need to do that, but the world, wherever you're doing this research, needs to move forward right with this. And I think the last one, and even though I think all of us will stand by our decision that a question over moratorium is better, there's many people can have different views about a moratorium on research or deployment, but our contribution will be trying to push this into even as fraught, right, an arena as a high-level panel convened by an SG or something similar to that. We could not come up with any kind of agreement on moratorium there. And so some people wanted to argue for a moratorium on research, others didn't. Some wanted to argue for a moratorium on deployment. My own view on this personally, right, is probably one that isn't terribly helpful, which is I don't think it's asking much to go to countries around the world and say, pledge that you will not put something in the atmosphere that doesn't exist. So so that was the range of, I think, disagreements, and some of those I think there's a lesson we learned here, and some of those, hopefully, the panel you're putting together now will agree not to struggle with some of those issues, but I think others that you definitely should try to, especially given what the role of an NAS study on this would be, as opposed to the kind of exercise we were doing.
Paul? I would just note, I remember long arguments about the moratorium, and I think, and each of these disagreements were very attractive. I mean, they were almost, they would pull us in because they seemed so important. But I think that I think the strength of this report was to recognize what what we could kind of, in an informed way, come to agreements with, and what we couldn't. And it wasn't simply parking those, but it was thinking of institutions that could better wrestle with them than we could. This was really an exercise in institution thinking more than it was these existential questions. But the existential ones are the ones that kind of grab us. And I guess it goes to what you were saying earlier. You know, people respond sort of from a gut or otherwise. And I think it took us a couple of years to let go of the gut and recognize where the traction of this effort could be made.
Genevieve, any lessons learned?
I wasn't part of it, so I'm learning them as we speak right now.
Yes,
oh yeah.
Just the one thing that I'll add, David and I and a couple of others staffed the report. So we took the unenviable role that you're taking with the work that you did. And so we had decisions to make with the group about how the report was going to finally be put together, whether it was going to be a consensus document, or whether it was going to be a majority opinion in certain respects, dissenting opinion type report. The group ultimately felt that the report was strongest when we just laid out as clearly as we could what the group could agree to, despite the range of opinions that they brought into the process and left the process with. And so you'll see a couple of times early in the executive summary, in the preambular language that characterizes the group and its effort, where we try to lay out quite clearly where the remaining disagreement is in the group. Right? And that in itself seemed a good exercise because it seems basically where the social conversation is. There's lots of diverse opinions around these things, but even with those diverse opinions, there are things that we can agree to that are required in the near term.
Let's take a question right in the side of the room.
Yeah. Hi, Darcy Gentleman, Science Communications. I wonder, at the risk of getting into a semantics debate, if this problem is presented as we have to be cautious and therefore set up a body to deal with caution and risk and that sort of thing, could there be a persuasive argument to say, no, actually this is an opportunity to figure out how to set up a system that could make for better future discussions so that things like what was learned through the Montreal Protocol versus the Kyoto Protocol is less likely to be so fraught. And so pandemics and other wicked policy problems that perhaps have nothing to do with climate have a forum model to find themselves better confronted.
Let's take one more, because we're getting towards the end. So another one on this side in the back there.
Sullivan Gassman. I'm a researcher with International Energy Partnership, and my question is, to an international nature regarding this problem. You mentioned in one of your objectives cooperation between countries being essential, and it definitely sounds like a no-brainer. Fate of the planet's at stake. Of course, we all got to work together. I'm just wondering, what some of you have thought about, ways to really foster cooperation. I know in practice it's often not how things work out. Like in the 50s and 60s, we had the great space race between countries, the U.S., the Soviet Union. There wasn't a whole lot of cooperation there. Innovation still happened, but in this case, if we're really going to work together, how do you think we're going to overcome that, intrinsic competitive nature between states?
Can you pass it up to the gentleman here? To pass it up a couple rows. Thank you.
Rafe Pomerantz. Sort of like the introduction about whether this was an issue to be introduced greater caution, or should we be introducing greater, what's the opposite of caution? Enthusiasm. How about that? Now, supposing the IPCC had been honest and said there's no way we're going to hit 1.5. In fact, we're probably not going to hit 2. And if we define those as catastrophic, then how come this issue doesn't make it into the policymaker's summary? So let's just assume for a moment that 2 degrees is catastrophic. Well, what's that do to the timetable of actually knowing whether we can deploy a system?
Thank you. So communications, cooperation, and enthusiasm.
Okay, these are good questions. I think there was a recognition early on that governance doesn't just mean no, and governance is not just about stamping out scary things, and that actually regulatory or sort of administrative structures can actually create incentives and can actually guide action. I think we tried to write in the report, in some parts, we tried to write in to see cooperation actually as a form of as an incentive to. I mean, if research is being shared, and there's a way to share that research in a way that feels both protected with regard to sort of intellectual property per se, and at the same time recognize that it could scale up because you're sharing that information. We tried to put into the recommendations ways that could happen, so that it wasn't, again, we didn't take, I mean, and I think this was, again, we didn't take a stand on deployment or not, but it's like, how can we get the best research on this? How can we, even in the funding stream where we asked for daylighting of the funding stream, there was a sense in which that itself could be an incentive, because we thought, well, who wants to sort of make public how much money is going into these research projects? But in fact, there is a sense in which there could be some pride in that, saying, you know, philanthropically, we actually want to save the planet here, and we see this as possible. So so I just say that we didn't see it as, I mean, there's a danger in SRM. There's a danger in climate change, and balancing those risks, and there was a slide on this early on, balancing those risks was part of the exercise and will continue to be part of the exercise. So it seems that in this moment of kind of unknowing, I mean, there are still things, there are big things that need to be understood in terms of secondary effects of SRM and so forth. Regionally, where this stuff's going to land, will it affect monsoons and so forth. There's some information out there. We need to know a lot more. So how can we collectively share information and scale this effort up, but under a rubric or sort of supported by administrative structures, so that it doesn't, so that it's actually could be as rational as possible. Now that's a hope that, you know, governance is never quite rational. I remember when you used this word, well, we were civil to each other, I was thinking to myself, how 20th century civility? But in fact, that's the way actually we build in civility into global governance. So again, I would just say that there was a strong recognition that governance is not about no, but it's about facilitation. And we want to facilitate research and facilitate sharing of funding and so forth. I don't know if...
I have a comment with respect to the last question. I'll use an analogy to explain what I mean. In economics, many economists, not all, but many, have advocated focus on economic growth, the number by which the GDP expands every year. That's what matters. For wealth creation, for the well-being of the nations, what it matters is a number. You know, if you go from 1% over 20 years to 2% over 20 years, your country, you move more people out of poverty than you could possibly imagine. So for a long time, the focus was get that number up year after year, whatever it is. Fast forward, 30 years after we started thinking that way, we realize there has a lot of, it's a pressure cooker societies where growth happened without internal distribution of that growth. It turned out that our single-mindedly focus on a number didn't reveal the internal realities of how that wealth created is allocated and what are the complexities of social and political structure internal to it. I feel the same way when I hear we are approaching to the 2% and everything is going to fall apart. It's a number, it's a clue. Science has provided us some way to organize thinking. I don't think any single scientist has committed us to mobilize the totality of society, our energy systems, just not to hit the average increase of temperature in the planet, because the effects are distributed very differently. And the effects of climate change are going to be distributed very differently, hitting equatorial countries first to begin with. So any rush to move the agenda faster because we are on the impending pathway or the HOV lane to hit the 1.5 or 2%, and that we should abandon prudence and embrace enthusiasm in the interest of doing this, sounds to me a lot like the recommendation of just focus on the GDP growth and nothing else matters. I think a lot of things matter on how you decide. And part of the point of report, as you see and as you read the pages, is, I mean, we need the organizations, we need the institutions that will give a voice to those who are generally excluded from the conversation when you're rushing to hit the mark. And that brings me to an additional point that I'll make it quickly, because I think the comments of Genevieve were just right on the mark to the biggest challenges of that we confront in the implementation of even our own ideas in the report. One of them is this: the combination of the epistemic and the political in the problem. If we're talking about a worldwide dialogue with the stakeholders, and we're talking about educating the stakeholders into the basic science, the basic facts, we should account, as she points out, of the difficulties of doing that. We live in days in which, by the way information disseminates, many people never get access to what is facts or what science produces. In fact, and I tell this anecdotally, one of my most popular or most retweeted papers was on geoengineering, but it was the most retweeted because there's a whole community of people who believe that the government for decades have been spraying aerosols into airspace from civil aviation. This community are paying a lot of attention to anybody who uses the word geoengineering. They retweeted my article more than any other article I have ever published. I mean, I emerged outside of anonymity thanks to this group. What if there's a significant portion of the population who really believes this? What if we're not talking about just, you know, a fringe, a negligible fringe, but a significant portion of the population? We cannot completely, you know, set aside 30% of the population of the world and say, well, even if you deeply believe in this, you know, you don't matter, or your opinion don't matter. I think we haven't resolved the challenge of handling the epistemic and political problems underlying the formation of belief with respect to this problem. And I think it's one of the hardest problems to really resolve. Before deploying this, it needs to be a legitimate decision that the nations of the world arrive to. How do you convince those who are persuaded, just like you are, about climate change, that the government has been injecting aerosols in civil aviation? It's a very difficult problem to resolve. How do we educate? It's a challenge.
Andrew?
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief so we end on time. But to the first question, I think it's extremely helpful insight that this is an opportunity to do something harder. And I think that this is part of the dilemma. So on the one hand, having been a U.S. negotiator in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, I would have reasons to believe, informed, I think, by similar experience that Genevieve had, that it's a really bad place where you want to put all the governance decisions on this or any other climate intervention technology. On the other hand, I would worry if we really need to create a whole set of new institutions, you know, to do this, because there's just a timing problem. and the ability to negotiate some new global compact on something. So if we can't cobble together, at least in the aggregate, kind of moneyball, the right kind of institution, or as I've written about many years ago, pick up something we don't use anymore, like the UN Convention on Environmental Modification, the old NMOD treaty, that just kind of no one looks at anymore, but I think it's actually quite nicely structured, uses the Security Council as a kind of a court of appeal for parties against each other. Something like that's going to really be required. And I think that partly what I learned from this exercise the last couple of years was that you got to like do some really hard thinking about this to get to a good place on it. And I believe that this is even more important now because it's not just this issue. It's the fact that we are facing what I can only describe as an era of global environmental triage coming up, just because of how much we've juiced things in the atmosphere now and where we expect things are going to go in the future, given limitations. So when U.S. government scientists, God love them, still at their job and their desks, working hard, are putting out papers that are predicting that by 2030 we're going to lose huge swaths of the Marshall Islands, just become uninhabitable. We've already got intensive internal migration going on in the small island states. You're already at a point where you're needing some kind of institutions that can step in that are not just about climate change, but about mobility, that are about welfare, that are about all the, what's called in the loss and damage, politely called in the loss and damage discussions, the non-economic losses and damages, right? Losses of whole cultures that we're facing right now. And you need something in there. Kind of goes back to the sequencing point. Start with the institutions we have, try to make them work, and then scale up. With respect to the second question, I'd only point you to, and this is not at all does justice to the question, but recommendation 9, where we grapple with this notion of why we think, for lots of reasons, you need to internationalize the research on this as soon as possible, and if at all possible, make it a requirement in the funding community because of, again, the global scope of this and the stakeholders involved. And that's the only way I can ever imagine a kind of a pathway towards acceptance for either a limited deployment in the Arctic, which Rafe has talked a lot about in the past, or let alone global moderated deployment. And then to Rafe's point, there's lots of reasons I think. There's the stigmata on this technology, which is part keeps it from showing up in the summary for policymakers, which I think is a problem. Personally, the other thing on this, obviously, and I think speaks to this is, I think the SRM section in the 1.5 report is fine. Problem is, of course, they're only reporting on existing science, and there just isn't a lot. And this is where we absolutely need someone to come forward with concentrated proposals for how to fund this stuff at scale to see if there is something that can be deployed, because we really don't even know that yet. And this is my particular way of looking at this again and again. I mean, we have no idea if there will be a deployable something. So that moderates to me the worries about the risk. So lots of worries about, it will not necessarily interrupt the Indian monsoon season or this or that, but we don't even know what we're talking about at this point. We only find out if there's an intervention here, if it is focused on, if we're able to do the research to try to do that. But the larger problem, Rafe, that you point out, I think this is, I hope you agree, is part of a bigger issue, which is that we do not have the institutions to set priorities on conventional mitigation, let alone things like this. We do not have institutions at most national levels, and certainly not at the international level, which can say definitively, for example, that we need to fast-track mitigation of short-lived climate pollutants. Methane, black carbon, hydrofluorocarbons, that we can slow down the rate of temperature change if we sink more resources into that, and we will deal with the worries that people have about whether or not that is, people think that's a substitute for mitigation of carbon dioxide, which is not. But we have no institutions that are willing to come forward and make that claim right now. And that's a problem that we've got to work on. Only until we have those can we face the question that you've put on the table.
Genevieve, any final thoughts?
So this is just very quick because time limitedness, but I do think one quick point is just that having a governance frame doesn't inherently choose caution over opportunity, right? It just says you have to think about these things very overtly in order to figure out kind of how we're going to see this or address it as a problem or as sort of solution. So I think it's an important question, but I do think that that's, we don't need to prejudice it in advance, I think I would say. And I think, I have other thoughts, but I'm going to just stop because I don't think we have time for them.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure you all could bring more questions to the panel after we conclude, but let's end now by thanking our panel very much. And our hosts here at Arizona State University for this lovely facility and event, and to Simon and the Forum on Climate Engineering Assessment as well. And thank you all for coming and bringing your questions.